The cold stone of the conciergerie never forgets. It remembers the sound of the tumbril wheels, the roar of the crowd, and the sharp, final whisper of the guillotine blade. But before the end, it held another secret: the slow, agonizing death of a queen. They stripped her of her crown, her jewels, and her children, but the deepest wound was the slow rot of her own body. This is the story of Marie Antoinette, not as the frivolous, diamond-draped legend, but as the ghost in a stone cage, where every hour was a battle against silence, hunger, and the merciless march of decay. Make sure to watch the video all the way till the end. I promise you're going to find it super informative. We put a lot of hard work into bringing you this content, so don't forget to hit that subscribe button, give the video a like, and share it with your friends. Your support helps the channel grow and motivates us to keep creating even better videos for you. The air in the conciergerie prison was not just cold. It was thick, a heavy, damp blanket woven from river mist, human fear, and the stench of unwashed bodies. For the woman who had once commanded an empire of silks and perfumes, this atmosphere was a constant, sharp reminder of how far she had fallen. Her name was Marie Antoinette, but within these stone walls, she was simply Prisoner 280. Her cell was a mockery of a room, a cruel joke played on a former queen. The walls, slick with moisture, seemed to weep perpetually. The furniture consisted of a simple cot, a rough wooden frame with a thin, lumpy mattress that offered no comfort, a single, unsteady wooden chair, and a small, scarred table. There were no tapestries to soften the light, no mirrors to reflect beauty, and no velvet to caress the skin. Every surface was hard, brutal, and unforgiving. The most horrific aspect of her confinement, however, was not the lack of comfort, but the lack of privacy. 2 guards were stationed in the cell, day and night. They sat in stony silence, their eyes constantly fixed on her. Eating, sleeping, sitting, even the most basic necessities of life. Every action was performed under their cold, unblinking gaze. Her dignity, a fragile possession she tried desperately to cling to, was systematically chipped away by this constant, merciless surveillance. This oppressive environment began to eat away at her health with frightening speed. Marie Antoinette had always been known for her robust beauty and vibrant energy, but the months of captivity had aged her body far beyond her 37 years. The food provided was meager and often spoiled, little more than scraps designed to keep her barely alive, not to sustain health. Malnutrition became a slow, quiet poison. Her once bright porcelain skin turned sallow and thin, stretched tightly over the bones of her face. Her luxurious hair, once powdered and styled, was now dull and brittle, often hanging in lifeless, gray-streaked strands. She spent most of her days sitting upright on the cot, trying to keep her mind from splintering. She was a woman known for her vivacity, now trapped in a stillness imposed by fear and exhaustion. Point 1. The separation from her children was the deepest agony. She could not touch them, could not comfort them, and could not even grieve their shared fate in private. Every tear she shed was a performance for her silent, watchful audience. The lack of control over her own life, the sheer helplessness, was turning the once proud queen into a fragile shadow. The cold of the stone seeped into her bones, but the real frost was the terror of being completely alone in a crowd of guards, unable to share a single, private moment of sorrow or hope with the people she loved. The physical decline was stark, but the psychological torture, the relentless stripping away of her identity and humanity, was the executioner's true, silent work. She was becoming a ghost before she was even dead, and the stone walls were her witness. The physical pain, the constant gnawing hunger, and the relentless thirst were small, manageable enemies compared to the terror of the inevitable visit from her captors. She knew every tap on the door meant another indignity, another piece of her old life torn away. The worst, most chilling visit was yet to come, the one that would prove just how much of a beaten animal they saw when they looked at the Queen of France. The Queen's rapid physical decline had not gone unnoticed by her captors. To them, her failing health was not a source of pity, but a potential complication. A natural death, or worse, a suicide, would rob them of the spectacle they craved, the public execution. Therefore, even in her extreme misery, Marie Antoinette remained a valuable possession that had to be preserved until the appointed moment. One morning, the heavy wooden door to her cell groaned open, and a man she did not recognize stepped in. He was not one of the usual silent guards. He carried the distinct, unsettling presence of someone involved in the administration of death. He was an executioner's assistant, a minor official whose job was to ensure the prisoner was ready and compliant for their final journey. The Queen, sitting hunched on her cot, watched him approach with weary dread. She had faced armies and courts, but the small, quiet indignities inflicted in this cell were often the hardest to bear. The assistant's purpose was quickly and brutally made clear. He was there to conduct a full, invasive search of her person. They suspected she might have a hidden means of suicide, a tiny sliver of glass, a concealed vial of poison, or anything that could allow her to cheat the guillotine. This search was not just a security measure. It was a final, devastating act of humiliation. They were stripping the last layers of her former royalty, treating her not as a human being, but as a dangerous object. The process was cold, efficient, and utterly degrading. The assistant searched her sparse clothing, her meager possessions, and finally, her body. It was during this awful, close examination that the full extent of her suffering was laid bare for a stranger to witness. The assistant's search revealed the horrifying truth of her physical state, a catalogue of neglect and decay. Her teeth were rotting. The years of stress, poor diet, and lack of dental care, a privilege she had taken for granted her entire life, had turned her once dazzling smile into a source of sharp, constant pain. When she was forced to open her mouth, the executioner's assistant would have seen the decay, the gray shadows spreading across the enamel. And then there was the white-coated tongue. This was a silent, visual testament to the severity of her dehydration and internal sickness. Her body was giving up, starved of both food and water. The white layer was a sign of fever, deep malnutrition, and the toxic buildup that came from a body desperately trying to survive on nothing. The man looking at her saw not the queen who had arrived in France in a shower of jewels, but an old, broken woman. Her face, drawn and hollow, was permanently etched with lines of pain and exhaustion. She was only 37 years old, yet she looked decades older, perhaps 50, 60, or more. The dramatic aging was a visual report card of her imprisonment, proving that stone walls and constant terror were far more effective than any natural disease at stealing a woman's youth and vitality. For Marie Antoinette, this forced scrutiny was a moment of profound despair. She could endure the cold, the hunger, and the guards, but having her physical decline, the evidence of her slow, miserable end, exposed to a brutal stranger was the ultimate invasion. They had stolen her family, her crown, and her life, and now they were taking the last thing she had left, the dignity of her private suffering. She stood there, a beaten shell, knowing that the physical decay was merely catching up to the decay of her hope. The physical indignities of the prison were matched only by the suffocating weight of memory. As Marie Antoinette lay on her rough cot, staring at the cold stone ceiling, a ceiling that never changed, never offered a painting, a fresco, or a shadow to interest the eye, her mind became her own cruel theater. In the darkness of her cell, the ghost of Versailles danced, an ethereal, tormenting vision of a life that felt like it belonged to a completely different person. She remembered the Petit Trianon, her private palace, where the air was always perfumed with roses and lilac. She remembered the laughter of her friends, the rustle of silk and taffeta, and the bright, effortless warmth of the sun streaming through giant, airy windows. Now, the only scent was the stale odor of the river and damp stone, and the only sound was the heavy, rhythmic breathing of her two constant guards. The contrast between her present and her past was a weapon her mind used against her. She was starving now, but she remembered tables laden with towering cakes, delicate French pastries, and fine wines, food she had barely noticed then, but which now haunted her dreams. She was thirsty, her tongue thick and cracked, yet she recalled the crystal glasses, constantly refilled with cool, clear water. This agonizing recollection of abundance made the simple, thin soup she was given feel like a final, deliberate cruelty. What truly crippled her was the memory of her children. She replayed their small, sweet voices in her mind, desperate to hold onto the sound before it faded entirely. She remembered the warmth of their hands in hers, the innocent, trusting way they looked up at her. Now, she didn't know where they were or how they were being treated. This ignorance was a crushing weight. The inability to protect them, or even to know if they were alive and well, was a sorrow so deep it dwarfed the fear of her own execution. This lack of intimate connection was perhaps the most sophisticated torture. When her family was briefly imprisoned with her in the temple tower, even that shared misery had offered a small solace. They could exchange glances, touch hands quickly under a blanket, or share a whispered memory. But here, in the conciergerie, she was utterly isolated. The guards were her constant companions, yet they were an impenetrable wall of hostility and silence. She could not speak to them, cry in front of them, or show a single moment of weakness without it being recorded and likely used against her. She had lost the most fundamental human need, the chance to share her grief. There was no private corner to weep, no secret moment to pray, and no one with whom she could share a single true thought. Her whole world was a stage, and she was forced to perform the role of the composed, dignified prisoner, even as her body failed and her heart broke. The luxurious cage of Versailles had been replaced by a stone one, but the new cage was far more effective. It didn't just hold her body, it systematically crushed her soul, leaving her to starve for the one thing she truly needed: human kindness and love. She closed her eyes, trying to conjure the image of her daughter, Marie-Therese, one last time. But the image was hazy, overpowered by the sharp reality of the cold, the hunger, and the constant, chilling awareness that she was utterly, completely alone. The two guards in the cell were more than just jailers. They were witnesses. They represented the eyes of the revolution, constantly recording every twitch, every sigh, every flicker of emotion that crossed the Queen's face. Their primary job was not to prevent escape, which was virtually impossible in the fortified prison, but to prevent her from achieving any semblance of peace or autonomy. They sat on their stools, their rifles leaning against the wall, observing her with dull, steady neutrality. Their presence was a living, breathing barrier to dignity. When the Queen needed to tend to her basic personal needs, the guards simply looked on. There was no curtain, no screen, and no moment when the cell truly belonged only to her. This forced exposure was a relentless psychological attack, designed to break the spirit of a woman whose entire previous life had been defined by elaborate ritual and exclusivity. In her palace life, a lady-in-waiting would have drawn her bath, another would have dressed her, and a third would have powdered her hair. Now, she was left to fumble with her coarse, few items of clothing, knowing every movement was being scrutinized by men who likely hated her and everything she represented. She became hyper-aware of her own body, which was now gaunt and weak, stripped of its former glory. The silence was another form of torture. The guards rarely spoke to her, and when they did, it was usually in curt, official commands. This lack of conversation created a vacuum, filling the cell with the deafening sound of her own despair. She tried, at first, to read the few allowed books she possessed, but the constant presence of the watchful eyes made concentration impossible. Every line she read felt judged, every turn of the page monitored. She devised small, desperate coping mechanisms to reclaim tiny bits of her private world. Sometimes, she would face the wall when she sat, pretending the guards did not exist, focusing only on the coldness of the stone. Other times, she would whisper prayers so softly only she could hear, finding solace in words that could not be overheard or misinterpreted. These were fragile defenses against the relentless assault on her personhood. One day, one of the guards coughed, a sharp, rattling sound that broke the monotony. Marie Antoinette flinched. For a second, the sound was a jarring reminder that her watchers were human, not statues. But the moment passed. The guard went back to his stony watch, and the queen returned to her silent suffering. They were present, but not connected. They were close enough to touch, yet worlds apart. The constant surveillance served its purpose. It eroded her sense of self. She was no longer a person with inner thoughts and hidden feelings. She was an exhibit, a specimen under glass. The world had come into her cell, and in doing so had stolen the last refuge she had, the sanctuary of her own mind. She learned to control her expression, to keep her face a blank mask, hoping to starve the watchful eyes of any interesting reaction. But the effort cost her energy she barely had, draining her day by day, breath by agonizing breath. She was trapped in an oppressive, endless theater of one, waiting for the curtain to fall. As the days blended into weeks, marked only by the shifting light that filtered weakly into the cell, the physical pain of hunger and cold became almost secondary to the intense, gnawing ache in Marie Antoinette's heart. This was the starvation of the spirit, the cruel consequence of absolute isolation from those she loved. The separation from her family was the deepest cut. She often thought about her son, the young Dauphin Louis Charles, who had been taken from her and subjected to the brutal re-education of the revolutionaries. The thought of his small, innocent mind being twisted and poisoned with hatred for his own mother was a torment worse than any physical illness. She had no news of him, no comfort, and the silence surrounding his fate amplified her terror tenfold. Her daughter, Marie-Therese, was her other preoccupation. The queen prayed ceaselessly that her daughter would somehow survive this nightmare and remember her mother not as the broken prisoner, but as the loving figure of their happy days. The inability to send a note, a word of comfort, or even a final embrace felt like a betrayal of her most sacred duty as a mother. During the brief period when they were together in the earlier prison, the Temple Tower, they had found small, covert ways to express their affection. A shared glance, a hand briefly held under the table, a quickly whispered, "I love you," when the guards were momentarily distracted. These moments, now gone, were treasures she replayed over and over in her mind. But here, in the conciergerie, there was no chance for shared grief or private tenderness. If her lawyer, or perhaps an official, came to visit, the guards would position themselves closely, listening to every syllable. Any talk that strayed from the legal proceedings and ventured into the realm of personal emotion was instantly cut short. This enforced emotional barrenness meant she was unable to share the crushing burden of her loss with anyone. She had to carry the sorrow for her husband, her children, and her entire life completely alone. The lack of private moments meant she couldn't properly mourn. Grief, when shared, can be a heavy thing, but when it must be concealed and swallowed whole, it becomes a toxic weight, poisoning the soul. She was forced to present a composed, even stoic, face to the world, even as her heart was being ripped apart. This constant suppression of natural human feeling was perhaps the most effective tool of her tormentors. They didn't just want her body. They wanted to extinguish the light of her humanity before they extinguished her life. She would spend hours staring at her hands. Hands that had once held crowns, scepters, and her children. Now they were merely bone and thin skin, cold and useless. They could not reach out, could not soothe, and could not comfort. They were a symbol of her utter helplessness. Marie Antoinette was dying not just from hunger, but from a profound and irreversible starvation of the heart, a cruel, calculated removal of all love and affection. The relentless cycle of cold, hunger, and silence continued, dragging Marie Antoinette closer to the inevitable day. Her body was a map of suffering. The pallor of her skin, the sunken eyes, and the tremor in her hands told the story of months of systematic neglect. But as her physical strength ebbed, something strange happened to her inner world. A quiet, steely resignation began to take hold, giving her a final, unexpected form of power. She had already lost everything: her title, her wealth, her family, and her dignity. There was nothing left for her captors to take. This realization brought with it a cold, clear sense of peace. The fear of death, which had been a jagged, constant companion, softened into the certainty of release. In her final days, she found strength in the very minimalism of her cell. The few things she possessed, a small cross, perhaps, or a threadbare shawl, became objects of intense focus, grounding her in the immediate moment. She started to pay attention to the minuscule details of her surroundings. The way a sliver of weak sunlight would move across the stone floor for a brief hour each morning, or the distant, muffled sound of a cart rolling over the cobblestones outside the prison walls. These small observations were her last connection to the world, a silent, internal rebellion against the monotony of her captivity. The executioner's assistant had searched her for hidden means of suicide, fearing she would deny the revolution its spectacle. But Marie Antoinette had quietly decided to meet her fate on her own terms, not through self-destruction, but through acceptance. She would walk to the scaffold not as a raving, fearful animal, but as a queen regaining her composure in the face of the ultimate loss. She spent her final hours composing her thoughts, perhaps writing a last, secret letter with the dull pencil and cheap paper she was occasionally allowed. The contents of that letter were not filled with pleas or regrets about her past life of luxury, but with expressions of enduring love for her children and a final, moving testament to her innocence regarding the crimes of which she was accused. Even this simple act had to be performed under the oppressive gaze of the guards. Yet the act of writing itself was a moment of profound mental privacy. On the morning of October 16, 1793, when the officials came to retrieve her, the transformation was complete. The woman who stood before them was frail, yes, and aged beyond her years, but she held herself with a final, unshakable dignity. The white coat on her tongue, the rotten teeth, the signs of a broken body, they were all there. But above the decay, a pair of eyes, clear and steady despite the years of tears, looked back at her executioners. She was stripped of her velvet cage and forced into the plain, white gown of a condemned prisoner. As they led her out of the conciergerie, the stone walls finally gave up their secret. They had imprisoned a queen, tortured a woman, and yet, in the end, they could not extinguish her soul. Marie Antoinette stepped out of the shadow and into the pale, uncertain light of her final day, ready to pay the ultimate price for the sins of her dynasty, finding a quiet, terrifying courage in her last, lonely steps. The horrific secret was not how she died, but how a queen was systematically broken down into a ghost, only to find a final, untouchable resolve in the face of the blade.